Why is this pagan face in so many churches? Now, if you've done any amount of time at all exploring the esoteric and the sacred sites that are scattered across our world, then I'm pretty sure you're familiar with this face. It's one of the most common symbols found carved into the exterior walls of churches throughout Europe. But who is this face, and why is it displayed so prominently outside places of worship? So, in order to answer that question, we're going to do a little bit of history. And if you like learning about the ancient world, then please make sure to leave a thumbs up on this video, because it really helps me out, and it allows us to continue making content for free. Anyway, let's get into it. Now, there are quite a few different faces that appear on these buildings, and they have various different names, depending upon their characteristic. The two primary ones we'll be discussing today are called the Green Man and the Red Man. You can find them both on the exterior walls of many churches, often on the wall corbels that hold up the roof or on the gate posts at the entrance. And even though they're found in places all over the world, here in North America, they're especially prevalent out here in the Pacific Northwest. Here's an example. If you visit the beautiful old cathedral in downtown Portland, Oregon, which was built between 1842 and 1867, you will see that on the exterior walls of the building they have carved no fewer than 4 different examples of the Green Man. And while the church itself has been home to many different denominations over the years, including Congregationalists, the original congregation that started it all here in 1843 was the Protestant Episcopal Church, also known as the Anglican Church, which is a continuation of the traditions of the early Catholic Church in England, before the split with Rome. And when we look at the history of the Anglican Church, we find that its roots can be traced back to the teachings of a man named Augustine of Canterbury, who arrived in England in the year 596. And if you'd like to learn more about his life, you can check out my previous video on the subject. But the important thing to know for this particular story is that Augustine was sent to England by Pope Gregory the Great with a mission to convert the Anglo-Saxon tribes to Christianity. And in order to understand why this pagan face would be found on Christian churches, we need to understand what England was like prior to the arrival of St. Augustine. Now, unfortunately for us, very little is known about the pagan beliefs of the Germanic people that lived there. We don't have any holy books or sacred texts from them. In fact, we barely have anything written at all from this time period. The only source we have for knowledge on the pagan Anglo-Saxons comes from the writings of those who sought to convert them to Christianity, which obviously leaves things in a bit of a gray area. We can, however, turn to other sources to learn about the religions of similar cultures who were living around the same time. And if we do that, we discover that the Germanic tribes of Northern Europe followed a religion very similar to the Celtic religion that was popular in the British Isles at the time. And just as today, the chief god of the British Celts was a horned god, often depicted as having the head of a bull. And their sacred sites, such as Stonehenge and Otherbeck, were often places where a festival would be held to celebrate the rebirth of the god each year at the spring equinox. In fact, if you studied the symbolism, you can see how similar the culture of the Celts was to the culture of the Germanic tribes. For instance, both cultures used a Triski Elian as a symbol in their art. Both cultures associated certain magical powers with a spiral shape, and both cultures had a reverence for horses and for bulls. So when Augustine arrived in England, it's likely that the local tribes also celebrated their horned god at sacred sites, like Stonehenge. And it's also likely that they held festivals during the solstices and the It is even possible that the church builders of old recognized this pagan heritage of theirs and attempted to integrate it into their new faith. After all, we know that early Christians often took existing cultural symbols and repurposed them for Christian teaching. For instance, the Yule log was a pagan symbol of the rebirth of the sun god at the winter solstice, but Christians later claimed it as part of their celebration of Christmas. Similarly, many scholars believe that the Easter bunny and the Easter eggs were remnants of pagan celebrations of the goddess whose name was used to inspire the name of the Christian holiday. So now let's get back to our two friends, the Green Man and the Red Man. The obvious similarity between their depictions and the horned god of the Celts and the Germanic tribes is unlost on us. But who were these figures, and why were they placed on churches? Well, first of all, let's talk about the Green Man. In folklore, he's often described as being a spirit of nature, sometimes referred to as the Lord of the Greenwood. He's typically depicted as a human face surrounded by leaves or vines, and sometimes flowers or animals. And speaking of the oak tree, this brings us to another interesting detail. Do you remember how I said that the Green Man was usually green in color? Well, actually, this isn't always the case. In older depictions from the Bronze Age, he was typically red. In fact, he was so red that he was often colored the same shade as vermilion. Now, if you've ever taken a class in plant biology, then you may already know that vermilion is the color of a certain part of a plant. But more specifically, it's the color of the unripened berries of a particular plant. And if you guessed that I was about to say holly, then you'd be right. Holly trees stay green throughout the winter, and it was this that made them special. Not only did they not lose their leaves like the other trees, but they also produced bright red berries that stayed on the branches long after the snows had fallen. So when the Druids came along and began associating the oak tree with the heroic warrior, they also associated the holly tree with the green man. And since the Romans invaded Britain sometime around the year 43 AD, we have written records that show us this connection. For instance, Pliny the Elder wrote, quote, "The inhabitants of this island make use of a shrub called the ilex, which is esteemed by them as the greatest ornament of gardens, because it retains its green leaves in the depth of winter." And he also writes that the Britons paint themselves with wine and the juice of the ilex. But perhaps the best evidence of the association between the green man and the holly tree comes to us from a book called Bononia, which was published in the year 1633. And whoever dared to cut down a holly tree in winter was sure to have his house burnt by the fairies. So now we come full circle. We can see how the green man was a nature spirit associated with plants and trees, and more specifically, he was associated with the holly tree. Then when Christianity came to England, it is possible that those who built the churches attempted to replace the old pagan gods with Christian saints, but they kept the symbols the same. And to be fair, this practice was encouraged by the church itself. As I explained in my video on the origins of Halloween, the early Christians often integrated pagan symbols and holidays into their faith, which helped to ease the transition from paganism to Christianity. So it's possible that the green man was seen as the embodiment of Christ, who was also associated with the holly tree. However, this may not have been the case. There are other theories about the origins of the green man that claim he was Yuan based on a pagan deity at all. Instead, they say he was a personification of spring or of vegetation. But either way, the point remains the same. He was a symbol of nature and of the growth of new life. So why would you put a symbol of spring on a church? Well, keep in mind that the builders of these churches were mostly illiterate peasants. They were Yuan theologians, and they didn't have access to books that would explain the intricacies of the Christian faith. They simply did their best to follow the stories they heard during Mass. And one of the stories they heard during Mass was the story of Jesus Christ rising from the dead. Now, when you think about it, that's a pretty potent metaphor for the season of spring. Every year, the cold grip of winter loosens its hold on the land, and the earth begins to awaken. Plants and trees begin to sprout and grow. Animals that have been hiding in their burrows come out to play. Birds return from their migrations, and the world is painted in new life. In many ways, the resurrection of Christ parallels the arrival of spring. Just as Christ came out of the tomb, bringing with him the promise of eternal life, the world comes out of its winter slumber, bringing with it the promise of bounty and plenty. And who better to symbolize this rebirth of life than the green man or the red man, who represent the holly tree and the oak tree, which remained green even in the depths of winter. So hopefully that answers your question. Why do so many churches have these pagan faces carved into their walls? And if you enjoyed this video, then please consider leaving a thumbs up below and subscribing for more content. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.